The retired cop's last case. If you think you've heard the most shocking story about justice delayed, wait until you hear this one. Subscribe now for more unbelievable true stories that will leave you speechless. Marcus Williams' hands were trembling that morning. But it wasn't from the Parkinson's. The words the doctor had just spoken were still ringing in his ears. Alzheimer's, early stage. Maybe a year, 2 at most, before his memory would be completely gone. The 73-year-old retired detective had already made the most important decision of his life as he walked out of that examination room. When he got home, he went straight down to the basement. He lifted the dusty lid of an old trunk he hadn't opened in years. At the very bottom, a brown folder lay waiting. The date on it showed 1983, the Jennifer Morrison case. It wasn't the only unsolved murder case of his career, but it was definitely the one that haunted his conscience the most. Back then, everyone was certain Brian Chen was the killer. The evidence pointed to him. Marcus had thought so too, but now, 40 years later, looking at the file in his hands, the doubt inside him was growing stronger. Brian Chen had been 19 years old then. A brilliant student studying mathematics at MIT, he lived in the same apartment building as Jennifer Morrison. When the girl's body was found, Brian's jacket was at the crime scene. Witnesses had seen him arguing with Jennifer that night. Marcus had been a young and ambitious detective back then. He wanted to close the case quickly, get that promotion. Brian's lawyer was inexperienced. His defense was weak. The jury had deliberated for only 3 hours. Life in prison without parole. Marcus looked at the photographs in the file. Jennifer Morrison had been 22, a Harvard Law School student, beautiful, intelligent, promising. When he looked at Brian's courtroom photo, he could still see that innocence in those eyes. He had ignored it back then. But as the years passed, that look had never left him alone. It followed him through 4 decades like a shadow he couldn't shake. He spread the file across his desk. His old notes, witness statements, evidence photos. He began examining them one by one. Something was missing. Something he hadn't noticed back then, or hadn't wanted to notice. It was past midnight, but Marcus didn't want to sleep. His time was running out, slipping through his fingers like sand. The next morning, he called his old partner, Detective Ray Thompson. Ray was still on the force, had 2 years until retirement. He was surprised to hear Marcus's voice. They hadn't spoken in years. When Marcus explained the situation, Ray's voice changed. He was worried. He said reopening that case wouldn't help anyone. Brian Chen had died in prison 5 years ago. Heart attack. But Marcus was determined. The truth needed to come out, even if Brian would never know it. He started tracking down the old witnesses. Most were dead or had moved away. But Jennifer's roommate, Sarah Mitchell, still lived in Boston. She was 62 now, a retired teacher. When Marcus visited her, the woman's face went white as a sheet. Even after 40 years, she remembered that night. But this time, she said something different. Something she hadn't said back then. Sarah told him that a week before Jennifer's death, she had found her crying in their apartment. Jennifer was having problems with one of her professors. The man had made inappropriate advances, and when Jennifer rejected him, he had threatened to fail her. Sarah hadn't told the police at the time, because Jennifer had begged her not to tell anyone. After her death, she didn't want to tarnish the girl's reputation. She had carried this secret for 4 decades. Marcus's heart started racing. He asked for the professor's name. Sarah hesitated, then spoke. Professor David Richardson. Marcus nearly collapsed when he heard that name. David Richardson was now Judge Richardson, one of the most respected members of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He had a brilliant 40-year career. The man who might have killed Jennifer Morrison had been dispensing justice for 4 decades. When Marcus got home, he started researching old newspapers. In 1983, David Richardson had been a young law professor. Jennifer Morrison was his student. Even more interesting, just 1 month after Brian Chen's arrest, Richardson had received an unexpected promotion and moved into prosecution. His career rise had started from that day. Every door had opened for him after Jennifer's death. But wait, the most shocking part was yet to come. The next day, Marcus found Brian Chen's old lawyer. The man was in his 70s now, living in a small town. He was surprised to see Marcus. He had quit law after that case. The guilt was eating him alive. He knew Brian was innocent, but couldn't prove it. But now he gave Marcus an important piece of information. The discovery of Brian's jacket at the crime scene had been very strange, because Brian had said he'd lost that jacket 2 days earlier. He'd left it on campus and never found it again. Marcus was starting to piece things together. David Richardson could have harassed Jennifer, killed her when she rejected him. He could have found Brian's jacket on campus and made him the scapegoat. But proving it was difficult. 40 years had passed. All the physical evidence had been destroyed or lost. Or so he thought. Just then, something unexpected happened that would change everything. One of Marcus's old informants, Tommy the Rat Martinelli, called him. Tommy was 68, a former criminal who had gone straight years ago. He had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and wanted to clear his conscience before dying. He said that in 1983, one day after Jennifer Morrison's murder, David Richardson had come to him. Richardson had asked Tommy to destroy some evidence. Tommy had taken the money, but being curious, he had looked at the evidence. It was a bloody knife and gloves. Instead of burning them, Tommy had kept them. He had thought about using them for blackmail, but Richardson's connections had scared him. Tommy still had those items. He had been renting a storage unit for 40 years just for this. He gave Marcus the key to the storage unit. When Marcus opened it, they were really there. In a plastic bag, a bloody knife and leather gloves. The blood had dried and turned brown, but it was still visible. Marcus's hands shook as he held the evidence that could finally bring justice. Marcus took these straight to the police station. Ray Thompson was shocked to see him with this evidence. Marcus explained everything. Ray didn't want to believe it at first. Accusing a respected judge like David Richardson wasn't easy. But the evidence was there. DNA technology didn't exist in 1983, but it did now. If the blood DNA matched Jennifer Morrison and Richardson's DNA was on the gloves, the case could be reopened. The test results came back 2 weeks later. The blood belonged to Jennifer Morrison. There was a partial DNA profile on the gloves. They needed a DNA sample from Richardson for a complete match. But this wouldn't be easy. Richardson had powerful lawyers and wouldn't accept such an accusation. He was too well connected, too protected. Marcus made a plan. He started following Richardson. He learned the man's routine. Every morning he drank coffee at the same cafe. Marcus went to the cafe one day, and after Richardson left, he took the coffee cup he had used. The fingerprints and saliva on it were enough for DNA testing. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. When the test results came back, Marcus's suspicions were confirmed. The DNA on the gloves belonged to David Richardson. Now there was enough evidence. Ray Thompson and the prosecution took action. The morning they raided David Richardson's house, all the media was there. His 40-year respectable career had crumbled in an instant. The mighty judge was led away in handcuffs. Richardson denied everything at first, but the evidence was too strong. Tommy Martinelli's testimony, the DNA evidence and other evidence Marcus had gathered. Finally, he broke down. He said he'd had a relationship with Jennifer Morrison, that she had threatened him. They had fought, and she had died accidentally. But Marcus knew this was a lie. This was premeditated murder. The man had planned everything, even framing an innocent kid. When the trial began, Marcus's Alzheimer's had started progressing. Sometimes he mixed up names, but he never forgot Jennifer Morrison and Brian Chen. The day he testified in court, the entire room was silent. He confessed to the mistake he had made 40 years ago. He said he had ignored Brian Chen's innocence, that his career ambition had overshadowed justice. His voice broke as he spoke about the innocent young man who had died in prison. David Richardson was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He entered prison at 75 years old. He would probably die there. As Marcus was leaving the courtroom, Brian Chen's sister Lisa approached him. The woman was 58 now. Her eyes were filled with tears. She hugged Marcus and thanked him. She had waited 40 years for her brother's name to be cleared. Her brother had died believing the world thought he was a murderer. Marcus went home that night, and for the first time in years, he slept peacefully. The Alzheimer's would progress. He would lose his memory, but at least his conscience was clear. He had paid his debt to Brian Chen. He had given the young man back his innocence, even if it was too late for Brian to know it. But here's where the story takes another incredible turn. 6 months later, Marcus could no longer remember most things. He was living in a nursing home, but the nurses said he constantly murmured two names, Jennifer and Brian, as if he was still trying to tell them something. Sometimes he would suddenly become lucid and tell anyone who would listen about a case from long ago, about a terrible mistake he had made, and how he had finally made it right. One day, Lisa Chen came to visit him. Marcus didn't recognize her, but when she mentioned Brian's name, his eyes lit up. He grabbed her hand and said he was sorry. Over and over again, he said Brian was a good boy, that he knew he was innocent. Lisa cried as she held the old man's hand. She told him Brian would have forgiven him. Marcus smiled then, the first real smile anyone had seen from him in months. The media coverage of the case had been extensive. Other cold cases from the 1980s were being reopened. DNA evidence was being re-examined. 3 more innocent people were freed because of the precedent Marcus had set. Judge Richardson's other cases were being reviewed. There were suspicions about other crimes he might have covered up during his rise to power. Richardson tried to appeal, claimed the evidence was planted, that Marcus was a senile old man making things up. But Tommy Martinelli, despite his cancer, testified from his hospital bed. He had kept receipts, dates, even a secret recording he had made of Richardson, asking him to destroy the evidence. He had been paranoid enough to protect himself, and now that paranoia was bringing justice. The Richardson case became a landmark in criminal justice reform. Law schools taught it as an example of how power and privilege could corrupt the justice system, how one ambitious professor could destroy lives and then sit in judgment of others for decades. The case led to new policies about preserving evidence and mandatory DNA testing for old cases. Marcus Williams died peacefully in his sleep. 3 months after the trial ended, at his funeral, there were hundreds of police officers, but at the front stood Lisa Chen. She held a photograph in her hand. It was Brian Chen, at 19 years old, smiling, full of hope for a future that had been stolen from him. Justice had finally been served. It was 40 years late, but it had come. Lisa stood at the graveside and remembered Marcus's last coherent words to her. The old detective had said that justice sometimes comes late, but real detectives never give up. Even when their minds betray them, even when the world forgets, they remember the innocent. Marcus Williams might have lost his memory, But he never lost his belief in justice, and that would remain as his legacy. The nursing home staff later found dozens of notebooks in Marcus's room. Even as his mind deteriorated, he had kept writing about the case. The same facts, over and over, as if he was afraid he would forget. Jennifer Morrison, 22, Harvard Law. Brian Chen, 19, MIT Mathematics. David Richardson, the real killer. The pages became less coherent as the disease progressed, but 2 words appeared on every page until the very end. I'm sorry. The district attorney's office created the Marcus Williams Cold Case Unit in his honor. Their mission was to review cases from before DNA testing was available. In their first year, they exonerated 7 wrongly convicted individuals. Each time Lisa Chen was there at the press conference, holding her brother's picture. David Richardson was found dead in his cell 2 years into his sentence. The official cause was heart failure, but inmates whispered about justice finally catching up with him. He had spent his final years in solitary confinement for his own protection. Other inmates, many of whom had been sentenced by him during his years as a judge, had not forgotten. The man who had dispensed harsh justice while hiding his own crimes had finally faced the ultimate judgment. Sarah Mitchell, Jennifer's old roommate, became an advocate for sexual assault victims in universities. She established the Jennifer Morrison Foundation, which provided legal support for students facing harassment from professors. She often said that staying silent for 40 years had been her biggest regret. If she had spoken up then, Brian Chen might have lived a full life. Tommy Martinelli died 6 months after testifying, but not before writing a full confession about all his past crimes and the people who had hired him. His testimony led to 3 more investigations into prominent figures who had used his services to cover up crimes. He said meeting Marcus had given him a chance to do one good thing before he died. Ray Thompson took early retirement after the case. The guilt of not listening to Marcus sooner weighed on him. He started working with the Innocence Project, using his connections in law enforcement to help review questionable convictions. He often said that Marcus had taught him that it's never too late to do the right thing. The apartment building where Jennifer Morrison had died was demolished years ago, but someone placed a memorial plaque at the site. It read, "In memory of Jennifer Morrison and Brian Chen, both victims of injustice, may truth always prevail, no matter how long it takes." Marcus's family donated his brain to Alzheimer's research. The doctors found that despite the advanced disease, the areas associated with moral reasoning and guilt had remained remarkably preserved. One researcher noted that it was as if his brain had fought to keep alive the part that sought justice, even as everything else faded away. A year after Marcus's death, a package arrived at Lisa Chen's house. It was from Marcus's estate. Inside was Brian's jacket, the one that had been planted at the crime scene. Somehow Marcus had managed to retrieve it from evidence after the trial. There was a note in shaky handwriting. "This belongs to Brian. I'm returning what was taken. I'm sorry it took so long." Lisa held the jacket and cried. It still smelled faintly of the evidence room, of must and time passage, but to her, it was her brother returning home after 40 years. She donated it to a criminal justice museum, where it stands today as a reminder of the cost of rushed justice and the power of redemption. The Boston Police Academy now includes the Marcus Williams case in their ethics training. They teach new recruits about the danger of tunnel vision, of choosing career advancement over truth. Marcus's photo hangs in the academy with a simple inscription, "A real detective never stops seeking truth." 5 years after the case was resolved, a journalist discovered something extraordinary. Brian Chen had kept a journal in prison. In it he had written that he believed someday someone would discover the truth. In one entry, dated just weeks before his death, he wrote, I forgive the detective who arrested me. He was young and ambitious. I hope one day he forgives himself. Lisa had that page framed. She liked to think that somewhere Marcus and Brian had found peace, that justice, though delayed, had reunited them in a place where time no longer mattered, where apologies were accepted and forgiveness was freely given. The Marcus Williams story became a Netflix documentary that won 3 Emmys, but for those who knew him, the real victory wasn't in the awards or recognition. It was in the image of an old man with a failing mind who refused to let injustice stand, who proved that conscience is stronger than disease, that truth is more persistent than lies, and that it's never too late to make things right. Today, if you visit the Massachusetts Supreme Court, you won't find David Richardson's portrait in the Hall of Judges. It was quietly removed. In its place hangs a simple plaque with the scales of justice, and a quote, "True justice requires not just judgment, but the courage to admit our mistakes." The last word goes to Lisa Chen, who still visits Marcus's grave every year on the anniversary of Brian's exoneration. She brings fresh flowers and a copy of the MIT newspaper that finally printed the headline, "Brian Chen, Innocent." She says Marcus gave her brother something more valuable than freedom. He gave him back his truth. And in the end, that's all any of us really want, to be known for who we truly are, not for the lies told about us.